Thank you very much, everybody. I'm Aftab Siddiqui. I'm in the board of directors of South Asia Democracy Watch. And we are going to talk about the current situation and the future scenarios in Afghanistan. Welcome for all the participants and all the speakers. And thank you very much for being here to talk about the situation in Afghanistan on a Sunday. I know I'm in Texas. It's 60 or 70s today, but I know people from Northeast, they are digging out from the Northeastern recently. So in this program, we will be focusing on the current situation in Afghanistan, the disaster that is taking place, and we will be talking about the plight of the Afghans there and the Afghan refugees who have been, if I may use the word, lucky enough to have been able to get out of Afghanistan, but unfortunately they are stuck in kind of a lengthy bureaucratic process. And then we will be talking about the Taliban, who have really failed to really bring in some governmental infrastructure so that and everybody knows that what to do and where to go in case of an issue, including the Afghans themselves. And I don't know whether what to say, but nobody else has none of the other countries have really recognized Taliban so far, and there is almost 37 million Afghans are really facing hunger, insecurity, and United Nations says that a couple of million will be really facing immediate famine-like conditions. And then the current Afghanistan, the so-called victory of Taliban in Afghanistan has consequences for the neighborhood, a neighboring country, Iran and Pakistan, and we are already seeing some of the negative consequences of this takeover by Taliban in Pakistan and United States is making the same mistake as they did earlier in 1990s. They just simply abandoned Afghanistan and walked away. And we all know the results, that there was a civil war, and what happened, we all know the history. So thank you very much, everybody. And a bit about South Asia Democracy Watch. South Asia Democracy Watch is an organization, nonprofit, tax exempt, based in United States, Texas, basically, but we do have had events in Washington, D.C., along with Wilson Center also. And we do focus on the democratic processes in the South Asian region and different countries. And almost 20% of the world population lives in that area, and that area has tons of problems. And the countries there don't seem to be really looking at the future, and they are really just involved in their tit for tat minor issues. And of course, some of these issues are not minor, but basically the countries are not really doing a better job of resolving the issues. So we've got a very good group of lineup of speakers, and I would really like to introduced Shakiba Murad, who is an attorney, community organizer, and humanitarian aid worker in Washington, D.C., the child of Afghan refugees. Herself, Ms. Murad began a national advocacy campaign in August 2021 to support the evacuation of our allies and to request resettlement aid. She also volunteers on the front lines of the refugee crisis and continues to fundraise to help meet the needs of the nation's newly resettled refugees. Ms. Murad, you've got 15 minutes.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Aftab. My dog has decided to join me here in this webcam. Thank you for having me this afternoon and joining us. As Aftab mentioned, I'm Shakeba. I'm just the child of Afghan refugees myself, DC-based attorney. And since August, I've been on the front lines of this refugee crisis here in the DC, Virginia area. So my parents were refugees in the early 80s, and they fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And they've had to work very hard for their new lives in America. They still contact me. They've been here for 40 plus years. And they still contact me to ask for help with job applications or anything they may need. And that's, knowing the language fluently now and living here. So that's what it is to be a child of refugees. It's never ending. So their story is not, unfortunately, unique in any way. It's all too common. I do enjoy storytelling, and that's what I'll do, but I'm going to start with a fact first. According to the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, Afghans make up one of the world's largest refugee populations. There are 2.6 million registered Afghan refugees in the world. 2.2 million of them are registered in Iran and Pakistan alone. That's over, what was that? 2.2 in Iran and Pakistan alone. And then they have another 3.5 million that are internally displaced. They fled their homes, searching for refuge within their own country. And that's a striking number when you consider the population of Afghanistan is around 37 million. If my math's correct, that's over 10%. What's baffling to me is what that number actually is. It's human bodies, it's people, it's daughters, infants, pregnant women, the elderly, young men that miraculously survived decades of war, and it's children, a lot of children. Numbers, when read or heard, they never resonate in a way that they should. There were approximately 8,000 refugees at Fort Pickett, one of the military installations in Virginia that housed incoming refugees under Operation Allies Welcome. So I went there. I heard there were needs, and I went there early. I went in early September when I found out how dire the situation was. And you hear there are 8,000 people, and you think, okay, that's the size of a college. It's smaller than the size of my university. 8,000 people, that's manageable. But no, that's 8,000 people without shoes, without soap, without medicine, without an extra change of clothes, without their loved ones. Spouses left behind, a father left behind, a mother left behind. That's 8,000 people that are bored, sitting outside in the sun. There's no sunscreen, of course. They have nothing to do. There's not so much as a pack of playing cards to pass the time. And that's 8,000 people that came with absolutely nothing but the hope for a better tomorrow. When I first got there, I drove and I drove and I drove, and I just saw people and people and people. And I kept driving, and I thought there'd be an end to it, right? I thought that I would see, okay, this is it. That's all there is. But no, I just kept driving and just saw people out in the field, sitting, doing nothing, looking lonely, looking bored, nothing to do. And then, you get out of your car and you go and introduce yourself, and you get swarmed because you're the first human interaction they have with the outside world. You're the Afghan American that's come to see them, and they're hoping that you can do something to help them. That's what I did. I drove around, observed, and then I went into action and helped. That's what I've been seeing here since the first time in September that I went on the refugee camp. Right now, since COVID spike started, We haven't been going just to preserve their safety. Most of my volunteer team did get COVID, so we didn't want to pass it on to the children there. But I went there every week, every Sunday, and we sent trucks there every week with donations to ensure that they would get what they didn't have. That's only one of 3 of the military refugee camps that Virginia had alone. There were 8 nationally. So 8,000 in Fort Pickett, that was one of the medium-sized camps. You had Fort Dix in New Jersey that's still operating. Fort Bliss in Texas, I believe, is still operating. Holloman just shut down last week, I believe it was. Fort Pickett should be closing in the coming week. Let's see, Fort McCoy was in the coldest location and had a tremendous amount of refugees. The Virginia ones we considered lucky. They had a strong community up here. We had refugee donation drives continuously running. DOD sending trucks to our mosques to pick up clothing, supplies, deodorant, toothbrushes, toothpaste, anything the military wasn't covering. And at that time that it started, keep in mind, the military camps were not prepared to house that many refugees. Nobody was prepared for this crisis. We're talking about over 60,000 refugees that were a part of Operation Allies Welcome coming into our country all at once from different lily pads. Yes, they would bring them, slowly. They were in Qatar and other places around the world, but over 60,000 people coming practically all at once. We're talking in the span of a couple of months. And we weren't ready for that. And the military wasn't ready for that. And they have resources. They can mobilize a lot quicker than most people can. That's our military. They're strong here in America. Think about what resettlement is like. Just think about the struggles we're having every single day. And I do mean every single day. I'm helping the number of families that I can help. And it's a struggle every single day. I'm going to tell you some of the stories that we encountered on the refugee camps, just so you know what refugees go through. You know what a byproduct of war is. One of the first cases that I was informed of was actually when I was hopping on a flight to Mexico, and I was in panic mode because I knew I would be out of country, but I had to handle this. There was an elderly man and he was wearing diapers and he required a wheelchair at Fort Pickett. He was in his soiled diapers for days in soiled diapers, an elderly man. He couldn't move because he rapidly resettling onto refugee camps. So there wasn't access to wheelchairs. There weren't adult diapers on the military base. There wasn't anything available to him. So I escalated in every manner I could. I contacted every agency I could. I just started an email storm, phone call storm. And by the time I landed in Mexico, it was handled. But that was because he had one strong advocate on his side that wouldn't give up. There were people that landed in our country that had blood on their clothing from the terrorist attack at the airport. Many, many people died, hundreds of civilians, and over a dozen US military service members. And the refugees that arrived, they didn't have a spare change of clothes. They were wearing blood-stained clothes for days. There were no culturally competent clothing shops on the camp as of yet. I know there's, I think it's an NPX. Someone in the military can correct me, I can't pronounce it right. But that's assuming they had the money to purchase anything. Most ran with nothing but the clothes on their backs. So we had to bring clothing to them. And attempting to clothe 8,000 people, the biggest struggle I've ever seen in my entire life, because you can't set up a shop. People can't try it on. It's trial and error. You hand out something, it doesn't fit them. They may or may not return it. If they don't return it, you're running out of shortage of clothes again, and you need to crowdfund that clothing. And it was a mess. It was a mess, and it continues to be a mess. A pregnant woman gave birth to her baby by way of a C-section. They did take her to the hospital, of course, for this. They moved her back to the refugee camp. This one's in up north. It was in Camp Atterbury. She was recovering for C-section surgery on a refugee camp. Her infant caught an infection and was then hospitalized and in the ICU. The doctor stated another infection will kill this infant. And they had to go right back to the refugee camp that the child got the infection in the first place. There's nowhere else to go. And the baby was prone to infections on the camp, but where are you going to take them? Somebody dropped the ball there and didn't escalate their case to get them off the base quicker. So I had to get involved. That happens. And when you're talking about 60,000 people, yes, you have strong advocates like me, but you don't have 60,000 advocates advocating for each one of these persons. So this is happening. And there are cases that we don't know about that haven't been resolved as of yet. There was this young child, and I love this little girl. I played with her every Sunday. One day she showed up in a sling, and I asked her mom, what happened to her arm? Well, she's a kid and there's nothing to do other than the Sundays that we would go onto base to play and engage the children and let them know that life will get better. But she was jumping on her bed. Kids like to jump on beds to have fun, I guess. And she fell and broke her arm. Her mother was so worried about treatment because she thought they didn't set it properly. And they know enough about medicine to know that a bone won't heal properly. And she complained to me, and she complained to the mayor cells is what they call it, and nothing happened. And then she got my number the next time I saw her on camp, and she said, "Can you help me?" So having the appropriate contacts at the Department of State and everyone on base that's a part of Operation Allies welcome, I escalated it. And, within 24 hours, they made an appointment for her. But again, I had to take charge there. They didn't really have access to that doctor in the way that they otherwise should and ensure a young child's arm heals properly. There was a human rights activist. She fell asleep for a few moments when she was being evacuated. She was in processing at the Dulles Expo Center right after she landed at Dulles Airport in August. And her prescription glasses were stolen. She slept for about 5 minutes. Somebody stole them. There's no value in that. It's a prescription. There's no chance it's going to be the exact prescription of the person that stole it. It's probably just a child that thought it was fun. But there wasn't an optometrist on base. She couldn't see. She's one of the first people I saw when I went to the refugee camp the first weekend I went. And it was a miracle that she happened to be there. And I was there because I met her at the airport and I remembered her glasses. But she, just let me know they'd been stolen and that there's nothing that they could do on the military base for her. And I found that shocking because I, as the typical American would think, oh, our government's handling it. But they were never equipped to handle this volume. It's a crisis. It's an emergency situation. So no, they didn't have an ophthalmologist on base. They didn't have an optometrist. I went to the medical tent with her. I asked for her prescription number and they couldn't tell me. I saw the eye vision chart pasted up on the wall and I said, well, do that test for me, please, and tell me the results. That's only one of several, I think 3 tests she has to have an adequate prescription. That's what they encountered. She was having headaches. She couldn't see. She lost her glasses. I'm happy to say that we, through a very, very, very generous optometrist, were able to host an optometry clinic on base, and an organization provided the prescription glassware for the over 100 refugees that they were able to see. But those instances stick with you because we're in America. If I lost my glasses, I would go right to the optometrist office. They would write me the prescription and I would order it through my insurance and it'd be here in a matter of days and I would be taken care of. But people on refugee camps don't have those same liberties. And that's what I had to see day and day and day again. I have never in my life received so many text messages or had to write so many emails escalating the serious cases. And those serious cases are the ones that stick with you. The infant with the infection that might die, the elderly people that just have the right to human decency. And the last one, and this was the last group of people I met when it was my last visit to Fort Pickett, and then coronavirus got out of control, so we can't go anymore. But there were a group of men that came up to me and just said, "Salam." Most of the time I would have brushed off. I was running to my car to get activities for the children, so I didn't have time to really engage with adults. But I said salam back and just said, "How are you?" And they responded and they asked me, "When will we get off this camp for resettlement?" And of course, a month and a half ago, I had no idea. I have no idea when they would be moved on. It was going out slowly, and we know it had to be slowly because the system off the base would be overwhelmed. But I told them that it would happen, soon. I couldn't tell them a date, but just be patient and be happy to be on the refugee camp where food is provided for and shelter is provided, because world on the outside is not always so easy. So I tried to give them a little bit of hope that, they weren't in the worst situation of their lives. And we conversed for a little bit. I was very busy, but they let me know they were part of the special mission wing. And this is a group of like the elite pilots and flight mechanics and whatnot that were asked right before Kabul fell to evacuate Afghanistan's planes and to get them out of the Taliban's reach. That was a request that we had for them, that their government had for them. And they didn't want to do it. They didn't want to leave their families because they knew that the situation was precarious and it wasn't the best time to leave their families and go fly planes to Uzbekistan. But they did. They took the planes, and there were 500 men, and they took the planes to Uzbekistan. And then they were stuck in Uzbekistan, 500 men leaving all of their families behind. We're stuck in Uzbekistan the entire time America was evacuating our allies. So their families were left behind. They wanted to know when they could get off the refugee camp, not because they were bored or anxious to go start a new home, a new life in a new home. It was because they needed a way to earn money to send it back to their families in Afghanistan, because they've left their wives behind with their young children, and their wives are not able to work. The Taliban won't allow them to work. And even if the Taliban allowed them to work, there's currently not an economy for it. So they just wanted to prevent their children from starving to death. And honestly, that particular interaction was the worst I had, simply because after they told me what happened to them, I couldn't look at them in the eyes anymore. I was ashamed. I was ashamed of what my country had done to theirs with 20 years of war. And this is how we left it. There's so many stories like this. And if I wrote them all, we'd be here till next year. And that is not an exaggeration. I've been on this since August. Every single day has shook me. And those were just the challenges on the refugee camps, right? Tens of thousands have been moved for resettlement purposes. Base after base is getting shut down. And what does that mean? If they're lucky enough, they're given an apartment for 3 months. Aftab mentioned earlier, some of them are still in hotels. Yes, they are. There are hotels in Maryland that have just refugees upon refugees because there's a shortage of homes. So the ones that are lucky are given a home, an apartment. They're awaiting mattresses because those are on back order. A family of 3 that I just got in contact with this week, they were given 3 forks, 3 cups, and 3 plates. The mother just asked me if they could have just some more plates so she didn't have to wash it right away to then give her child a different item on her dish. Nothing more is given because resources are limited. If you give one family of 3 6 plates, let's say, then you don't have enough for the next family that comes. Their food stamps haven't all been processed yet. The community was dropping off food for these families. They were so anxious, not knowing where their next meal would come from. The times that I did home visits and they told me they didn't have groceries. Well, that to me, of course, is a shock because I can snap my fingers and get a donor to provide family food for the week. I opened their fridge with permission, and they had food in their fridge, and I realized it wasn't the today they were worried about. It was about the tomorrow. Will the organization continue to support them until the food stamps kick in for them? That's what they were scared of. Some of them did not have food at all. Some had been, they slipped between the cracks. But for the most part, our community here in Northern Virginia had come in very strong and had food delivering, volunteers delivering food and doing drop-offs to ensure no one went hungry. When the food stamps do come in, they don't know how to go to the grocery store. They don't have a means for transport. They have little, if anything, to their name. They don't have a bike. They don't have a car. They don't have any familiarity with the lay of the land. At our grocery stores, anytime they change an aisle, I get really upset because I don't know where to find anything. Imagine walking into a grocery store, not knowing the language, not knowing anything, and trying to find what your family needs. And then trying to budget with a currency you're not familiar with, trying to predict how much you can and cannot have. It's hard. I've been there when my parents, oh gosh, when I was a child, we would go to the grocery store with my mother. We would pick the grocery store that was the furthest away because it was the cheapest one. And we would put the necessities in the front on the conveyor belt. And my mom would keep some other things in the back. So she would watch the cashier's, the total amount, watch it very carefully. And then at a certain point, she would ask the cashier, oh, please stop bringing up, we can't afford the rest of that. That's what I grew up with. That's the child of an Afghan refugee. I remember those days. That's why I'm so passionate about this. So they want to learn English, but they don't have a computer to take online classes. They want a job, but they don't have a way to apply or any way in developing a resume or any help there. I'm trying so hard to get volunteers to help in resume development. We're at a shortage of volunteers. We have volunteer burnout. We've been doing this since August. The ones that do get a job, there's no way to go get to that job. You have to rely upon a bus system they don't know. They have to count on someone teaching them that bus system. And then it takes about an hour to get to work. And of course, the bus is not always that on time or accurate. And especially during COVID, we don't know if they'll get to work on time. So this is a struggle for them. It gives them a great amount of anxiety. They need to take their newborns to the doctor. They don't know how to do that. So they contact their caseworkers, and the caseworkers don't always respond. And I'm not faulting the caseworkers. They're incredibly overwhelmed. They used to handle, I think, 15 cases, and now they have about 70 to 75. They're very overwhelmed. So if these refugees don't have a friend, a family member, or neighbor that they can ask for help, they endure and they wait and they pray to God. And as Aftab said, these are the lucky ones. They thank God because they made it to America. This is America, and this is what they've experienced in our country and what they continue to experience. What they face elsewhere, I guarantee you it's no cakewalk if it's this difficult in America. The Afghans that worked with NATO, with the Americans, they're desperately trying to get out, hoping that one day they received that call that it's their turn for the evacuation. There were lists upon lists upon lists created. Human Rights First had lists. State Department had lists. You have to provide documentation showing that you worked with the Americans, and then you might have a chance at evacuation. And we haven't necessarily stopped those evacuations. Last I heard, we are continuing to evacuate those persons that would qualify for SIV. So our president has kind of fulfilled that promise in some ways. It's not as quick as we would like, but we know what quick is. We know that 60,000 plus refugees broke our system here.
Shakiba?
Yes.
You're out of time now.
Okay.
But thank you very much for all the work that you do. And thank you so much for coming here and talking to us about the plight of the refugees here. And please stay around for the question and answers. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. And now the second speaker is Michael Kugelman, the Deputy Director of the Asia Program and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center, is a leading specialist on Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan, and their relations with the United States. The editor or co-editor of 11 books he has written for the New York Times, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and other publications, covering topics ranging from US policy in Afghanistan to terrorism to water, energy, and food security in the region. Michael, you are on for 15 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Aftab. Thanks for having me. And I apologize for being here late. I had trouble logging in for some reason, but it's a pleasure to be a part of this very important panel on a critical topic that I worry the world will soon forget about, quite frankly. And I should also say it's a pleasure to be back with South Asia Democracy Watch, the Wilson Center's partner for an annual lecture series in honor of Asma Jahangir, the late, great Pakistani human rights activist. We really appreciate that partnership. So I've been asked to briefly talk about the current situation in Afghanistan and future potential scenarios. unsurprisingly, this will be a set of very depressing comments. My bottom line is that things are likely to go from worse to even worse, and that the trend lines for Afghanistan could not be any worse. But before I get to that, I do think it's worth asking the question, are there any silver linings? Can we point to any positive developments in Afghanistan these days at a moment when there have been nonstop bad news stories for months? And I would argue that there are a few, though they all have caveats. One is that the war in Afghanistan has ended, a war that for Afghans had, of course, raged for more than 40 years, stretching from the Soviet occupation in 1979 to the anti-Soviet insurgency in the 80s, and then a period of civil war in the 90s, followed by brutal Taliban rule in the late 90s until 2001, when, of course, the US entered and the Taliban insurgency followed. So the war did end when the Taliban seized power. You don't have fatalities from violence on the levels that you had during the war. This does not mean that there is no violence and brutality and terror in Afghanistan now. There is. The Taliban has, of course, ruled with an iron fist. It's cracked down violently. Islamic State Khorasan, that terrorist group, is carrying out horrific attacks. But on the whole, fatalities from violence are way down because the war has ended. Second silver lining that I'll briefly highlight is that some of the very basic infrastructure, and I emphasize very basic infrastructure, has remained operational. And I'm not talking about, service delivery and that type of thing. I'm not talking about all the roads and the bridges that have been destroyed by years of war. I'm talking about the fact that, for example, the airport in Kabul remains functional. And I was talking to a friend, a journalist friend, who's been in Afghanistan since the Taliban takeover, and I asked her, is there anything good to report these days? And she said, well, yes, people are flying in. And this means that relief supplies can get in from the air and so forth. So it's encouraging. I think we're perhaps scraping the bottom of the barrel, but it's something for sure. The third silver lining is controversial and certainly would only be viewed as a silver lining by some in Afghanistan, for sure. And that is that this issue of the foreign military presence, that it's gone, that there is no more foreign military presence in Afghanistan. Now, certainly many Afghans, from the political elite, from the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, those that had worked with the Americans and the NATO presence over the years, those that had benefited from all of the gains of the last 20 years, particularly in terms of improvements in education, healthcare, and rights, especially for women. Clearly, many of them, I think, would have preferred that the foreign troops remain, but there are plenty of Afghans who viewed the foreign military presence as a problem, especially those who were mistreated by foreign military forces or those who lost families and friends in airstrikes and so on. So I think that it's important to keep in mind that the US military presence in Afghanistan during its final few years did not stop the emergence of a new terrorist threat, the Islamic State Khorasan. It did not stop an increasingly violent and potent Taliban insurgency. So I think it's important to remember that it's not just the Taliban that wanted the US to leave. There were others that did as well. It's important to remember. But all that said, clearly all is not well in Afghanistan right now, to put it very mildly. And I would briefly argue that Afghanistan right now is simultaneously dealing with three complex and serious crises, all of which figure to get worse in the coming weeks. The first is, of course, the humanitarian crisis. You know the scale of the crisis. 22 million people at risk of starvation, 1 million kids that could die of famine or starvation in the next year, most healthcare facilities having shut down for lack of funds, 90% of the population destined for poverty this year. It's simply mind-blowing, the scale of all of this. And Afghanistan, of course, had been experiencing significant levels of economic stress well before the NATO withdrawal and Taliban takeover, but it was propped up by a war economy and heavy international assistance. Those safety blankets have been ripped away with most international assistance having stopped and been replaced with sanctions after the Taliban takeover. And the international community has rallied to provide humanitarian assistance, a lot of it. But Afghanistan, of course, needs more than humanitarian assistance because the economy is at risk of collapsing. There's no money in banks, there's a liquidity crisis. The international community is now trying to devise a plan that would allow more money to flow into Afghanistan separate from humanitarian aid that would reach Afghans and banks and so on without ending up in the hands of the Taliban government. but it's very hard to do that. And the key donors, the US and much of the West, much of the Western countries are not comfortable putting money in the hands of the Taliban. And private donors, especially banks in the West, are very nervous about sending more money in for fear of running afoul of sanctions. And so while the international community dawdles, the situation is just getting worse. And I think it'll continue down that track. There are a lot of good ideas out there, and I'm happy to discuss some of them, but there's no consensus within the international community. Even the US government lacks a consensus on what to do. And think about that for a second. There's no agreement within the US government on how to address the world's biggest humanitarian crisis, one which was provoked in part by the US itself when it decided to impose sanctions and freeze those Afghan government assets. It's also worth noting that even if Afghan government assets abroad were unfrozen and some sanctions were eased, and many are calling for this for good reason, even if that happened, there would still be problems. There would still be major obstacles. The Taliban lack the absorptive capacities and the capacity on the whole to manage all this money that would suddenly be coming in. They need help from the international community. And that would entail more time needed for the international community to devise a plan for how to help manage such high inflows of cash. And this gets me to the second major crisis that figures to worsen in Afghanistan, and that is governance. The Taliban are dealing with multiple complex crises: humanitarian, economic, security. Even the best, most experienced policymakers would struggle to fix. But this is the Taliban. It's a violent insurgency. Its only experience with governance has really been the brutal forms of justice for which it is notorious. It's run some shadow states and services in areas it's controlled over the last few years, but that's a lot easier to do when an insurgency than when in charge of a whole country. So many insurgent groups have learned the hard way over the years that when they become governments, it's not that easy to effect that transition. Certainly there are technocrats, a number of technocrats that have stuck around and are now serving in the Taliban government. There's a very well-respected economist, Nazir Kabiri, who ran a think tank in Kabul previously. He's a senior official in the Taliban finance ministry now, but that's an exception more than the rule. The Afghan civil service has many, many missing jobs. So many government employees in the previous administration fled, or they're too afraid to come to work. The Taliban have replaced them with their own, and they literally don't know what they're doing. I was speaking to someone the other day who said that during her visits to Taliban government ministries, it's become clear to her that many of the Taliban employees have no clue how to operate a computer. So there's this extreme paucity of governance capacity in a moment when there are extreme crises that demand the strongest governance capacity possible. And if that weren't enough, the Taliban are also dealing with distracting issues like internal organizational divides, as well as a rising terrorism threat. And that's the third crisis I'll highlight, the one that's often forgotten. IS Khorasan, which of course is the local chapter of Islamic State in Afghanistan and the region, it's been around for about 8 years in Afghanistan. It's never been as potent as the Taliban. It struggled to find allies in a country where most militant groups, including the Taliban, have been and remain allied with Al-Qaeda, Islamic State's rival. But IS Khorasan was resilient for many years, surviving constant NATO and Afghan airstrikes and continued to carry out attacks. Now, I would argue that ISK has been strengthened by the NATO withdrawal. It's no longer being hit by airstrikes. It's facing Taliban offensives, but those are on the ground. It's not getting hit as hard as it used to. The Taliban don't know, or at least they don't yet know, how to operate aircrafts unless someone, perhaps the Pakistanis, teach them, which is a whole other issue. So ISK isn't being hit as hard militarily as it used to be. Also, the collapse of the Afghan security forces and departure of US forces mean that many weapons have been left behind. The Taliban acquired most of them, but ISK has had opportunities to grab many of these weapons too. Furthermore, when the Taliban took over, it staged very large jailbreaks, which let out a large number of prisoners, including quite a few ISK fighters. The Taliban did not bother to figure out which terrorist group these prisoners were a part of. So as a result, the Taliban ended up helping its rival by freeing a bunch of ISK fighters. So their manpower has been boosted too. And I'd also argue that ISK is enjoying a potential recruitment bonanza. There are plenty of Taliban fighters who have only known a life of fighting. They don't know how to adjust to civilian life. especially when there are no jobs or education opportunities in a state system that is really near collapse right now. So many could well jump ship to ISK. And also, in an indication of just how desperate things have become, there have been some former Afghan intelligence operatives who had been a part of the NDS, the Afghan intelligence agency, who have joined ISK. And my sources on the who have been on the ground claim that up to several hundreds of them may have joined ISK. That's pretty scary, if true. And of course, with the level of privation so high in Afghanistan now, prospects for radicalization are high, meaning there could be fresh ranks of recruits that join ISK to take on the Taliban or others. Finally, to emphasize, Islamic State is a rival of the Taliban. It wants to make the Taliban look bad. It wants to undermine the Taliban. This has meant attacks on the Taliban. Most of ISK's attacks in Afghanistan since the Taliban takeover have targeted the Taliban, not civilians, though for sure they've targeted civilians too. So as I begin to wrap up, I think in considering future scenarios for Afghanistan, I think one of the key questions to consider is whether the Taliban, will it stick around? Will it struggle to hold on? Will it consolidate power? Obviously, don't want to speculate too much, but my view is that the Taliban is here, but not necessarily to stay. It's certainly conventional wisdom is that we need to learn to deal with the Taliban because it's the only show in town. And that's true for now. There's no viable opposition right now other than Islamic State Khorasan. The current anti-Taliban resistance, the Panjshir movement, is very weak. It's had to seek sanctuary next door in Tajikistan. Keep in mind that the Taliban pretty much controls all of Afghanistan now, unlike in the 90s when they controlled about 90%. And the Northern Alliance was able to carve out space and sanctuary and holdouts in the north, which the Taliban didn't control. But today, territorially speaking, the Taliban is everywhere in Afghanistan, not to mention the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, the Afghan state pre-Taliban takeover has completely collapsed. So the government, the previous government, the armed forces, much of the elite that went with them, they're pretty much not there anymore. So it's just the Taliban. And I think it also bears noting that even though the international community has not formally recognized the Taliban government, it's not treating the Taliban like a pariah. Senior diplomats from countries around the world, including the US, are regularly meeting with the Taliban. Norway hosted a major diplomatic conference last week. The Taliban itself hosted an international diplomatic conference in Kabul a few weeks back. So it's not like the world is avoiding the Taliban, it's accepting the Taliban in a de facto way. And I think that helps burnish the external legitimacy of the Taliban. But here's the thing, and I'll conclude here. The Taliban's governance deficits are contributing to its inability to ease the twin crises of economic meltdown and terrorism. If people are unemployed and hungry and increasingly desperate, certainly some may blame the US for the sanctions, but many may turn their anger on the Taliban government. And now the terrorism danger is not nearly as acute an issue as the humanitarian crisis now. ISK is staging attacks on the Taliban, but this in and of itself doesn't threaten the Taliban's political survival. But what's dangerous for the Taliban is that ISK is trying to deny legitimacy to the Taliban by undermining the Taliban's core message following its takeover. And that message is, we've ended the war, we've restored security, join with us now as we build a nation of peace. But when your government is getting attacked, and when your family and friends are getting attacked by terrorists, well, then that flies in the face of the Taliban's promises of restoring security. And with the Taliban under so much strain to address these policy emergencies, that could exacerbate in time the internal divides within the group. And that could become a distraction that makes addressing the policy crises even harder. So my point is that in due course, we could well see the emergence of new sources of armed resistance. And this being Afghanistan, it would not be linked or centralized. It would be separate and disconnected. New resistance movements could crop up in the north and the south and so on. And this could breathe some momentum into the Panjshir resistance. We're not at this point for sure now, but if in the coming months the humanitarian crisis continues to worsen and the terrorist attacks continue, the Taliban could face some major tests. What we could see happen potentially down the road is that these armed factions try to start chipping away at Taliban control in the periphery, perhaps taking territory in areas where the anti-Taliban resistance have long had strength, like the north. Won't be easy this time around, as in the 90s, because the Taliban controls more territory than it did then. and also because the Taliban has very cleverly co-opted some of the ethnic minorities, the Tajiks and the Uzbeks, that tend to make up the majority of the resistance over the years. There have been a number of Tajiks and Uzbeks that have joined the Taliban in recent years. So this could constrain the growth of the resistance, but it could still happen. And if the resistance hypothetically were to chip away enough, that's when the Taliban would have to worry about a civil war situation where it has lost a critical mass of territory to anti-Taliban factions. And in this context, we could expect external players to start backing some of these anti-Taliban factions. And here I'm referring to regional players like Iran, India. But I do think the resistance would be less likely to get support from external players now than in the 90s, just because the world is more willing to engage with the Taliban now than it was in the 90s. And I think also the West, including the US, they're out. They're no longer in the game. They have no compelling interest to be involved in Afghanistan anymore. So on that note, happy to speak more about the role that the US could play in Afghanistan in the future, but I could save that for later. So I will conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been wonderful hearing such an analysis from you, Michael. Very good analysis. Thank you so much. I would really like to mention two guests who have been here. Wali Ahmed Shirzad of Human Rights Watch. Thank you for coming, Wali Saab. And Ms. Sabra Bano of Gender Concerns International. Thank you very much for being here. And I have received a note from Raja Muzaffar of JKLF, Kashmir, independent activist. He says that please count Kashmir as neighbor of Afghans. The Wakhan corridor, 140 miles long, in Badakhshan province, separate Kashmir and Afghanistan. And so please let your audience and panel know. So Raja Saab, we all know about that. Thank you very much. And now we move on to the next speaker. We've got the next speaker, Miss Yasmin Afghan. She is an activist and journalist, and she is based in Europe. We might not see her face because of security concerns, but Miss Yasmin, you are on for 15 minutes.
Thank you so much. Hello to everyone. It's nice to be here, and I would really like to thank every one of you for taking out the time to discuss the situation of Afghanistan, especially at a time when the whole world is somehow trying to normalize the Taliban, which you all are well aware of, that this group is a terrorist group, and they are holding Afghans as hostages at the moment. And for the past 20 years, the long years of war, they were the main factor that were creating insecurity in Afghanistan. As Mr. Michael said that maybe some of Afghans, they didn't want the US or the international forces to stay in Afghanistan. I'm one of those people, though I've not lost anybody in the bombings, but I was against the occupation. But it does not mean that we wanted the Taliban. So there's a big difference. If we didn't want the international forces in Afghanistan, we don't want the Taliban too. So I just wanted to say thank you for coming together and for trying to talk about Afghanistan. The current situation in Afghanistan is terrible, heartbreaking, and painful. I don't want to break down because I'm in constant contact with people throughout Afghanistan. At the moment, I'm trying to help and teach Afghan school students and university students English. So I'm in constant contact with them, and the fear that these young girls and women feel at the moment is unimaginable. And especially seeing your killers or those who were planting bombs and now they are ruling over you, and you are being deprived from your every right. It's one of the most shocking things, even though I'm living in one of the safest countries in the world at the moment. But if I tell you that the day we lost Herat, we had already lost Kunduz, I was like, okay, we have lost Kunduz a couple of times in the past too, but the day we lost Herat, I knew that Afghanistan is gone. It's gone. And within days, the Taliban were in Kabul. My own family, they had to leave Afghanistan because the security situation was so terrible for them that they had no option but to leave. And just as Shakiba Murad put it, that they are the luckiest. They are the luckiest that they were able to leave. But those unfortunate people, and it's 37 million people or 35 million people are still stuck with a terrorist group, and they do not have a future at the moment, no hope for a better future. And it's really heartbreaking, especially when the media, some section of the media is trying to normalize the Taliban. And this is what it makes us angry, that how can the West turn a blind eye and try to accept the Taliban, even, okay, they are not recognizing them at the moment, but it's a slow step towards recognizing them. Just like we had the Oslo meeting, we had it. They welcomed the terrorist group, the killers of Afghan people, and they tried to talk to them, to negotiate with them. So I'll just go, this is an overall background that I wanted to talk about, but now I'll go to day-to-day life and what changes have been introduced and brought. And unfortunately, the changes are not good, and it's grim. The security situation is not good at all. The Afghan media is scared of reporting what is happening inside Afghanistan because they have been threatened again and again. If they report anything, though sometimes some issues they come out, like some IED attack, or if somebody is killed, these are just a small section that comes out to the media, but the majority of it is covered, it's censored, they are not allowed to report on it. And the media has been threatened about it, that they should not report. The Taliban are showing the world that, okay, we have security. No, we don't have security in Afghanistan. People are still kidnapped. People are killed for a very small amount of money, for even having a mobile phone. It's inside Kabul, and outside Kabul, the picture is really terrible. And the other most important thing is that the situation of Afghan women, it's terrible. Their freedom of movement has been curtailed. Okay, the Taliban announced that they cannot travel for a longer mile or few kilometers. But the truth is, when I talk to my colleagues, former colleagues, or to common people, I've realized that even a 5-year-old son can protect you, can be your male guardian when you go go out for shopping or go outside. A 5-year-old son can be your guardian. Women have lost all their freedom, their voices, and they have been, the hijab has been introduced. Okay, now many people might put this that, okay, Afghan women were wearing the burqa or the blue veil. It was in the villages, but inside Kabul or the major big cities, things were changing. And it's not now, it's not for this 20 years. Afghan women had the freedom to many, they could vote long before many other countries. So it's not the modern, it's not the past 20 years, what I wanted to say, that these rights have been introduced. And Afghan women have fought, I have fought for these rights for the past 20 years. And now we all have lost those rights, our voices. We cannot raise our voice, because if we raise our voice, if we demonstrate, the Afghan women who were demonstrating, the civil society that was demonstrating for freedom, for work and bread, they are, 4 of them are imprisoned at the moment, but the Taliban are denying it. They just deny that they are imprisoned, but they are still imprisoned. The other thing is that the compulsory dress code, not only for women, that they have to wear the niqab or hijab, but for men too. Videos were circulating a few days ago, though the Taliban want to show that they are chained Taliban, and they were very calm when they were telling people, okay, start growing, to the men, that start growing your beard, it's part of Islam, it's Sunnah, this, that. But outside Kabul, it's terrible. Men have been beaten, women have been beaten for going outside their houses. And it's not inside Kabul, because still the focus, they're somehow focused on Kabul, and they want to give a better picture of the situation. And they say that, okay, the world is focusing on Kabul, but go to a remote place, like for example, in Kunduz, the Shtarchi, the situation is terrible. Women cannot go out without this black hijab or a burqa. They are not allowed. And the same is with men. The women have been decolorized. They cannot wear certain colors, and especially you only have to wear dark black colors, not colorful colors. And access to employment. Afghan women especially, they have received the biggest blow over the past few months. They have lost their jobs. Just I was reading yesterday that female lawyers in Herat, they cannot work anymore. They are banned from having offices and fighting cases. And even just like Mr. Michael said, that the Taliban have their own group members who are now trying to run the government, and especially women have lost their jobs. And access to education. We know that the majority of girls cannot go to school at the moment, from grade 7 till 12. And universities are closed at the moment. But yeah, the Taliban are saying again and again that they will reopen the schools and reopen the universities. What they say is that, okay, the excuse is that we want to have Islamic schools or universities. This country was Islamic. You have not brought Islam. Before the Taliban's return to power, we didn't have co-education in schools, in the government schools. Why are the government schools closed at the moment? So these are just excuses for depriving Afghan girls from education. The other most important thing is forced evictions. I've read reports and have talked to people, especially our brothers and Shia brothers. They were forced out of their houses. At least 400 families were forced out of their houses in Helmand province, and the other largest forced displacement took place in 15 villages in Daikundi and Oruzgan provinces, and at least 2,800 Hazara residents were forced to leave and relocate to other places. That too, especially, first, it's inhuman to forcefully displace people. Secondly, at the peak of winter, you force people to leave your houses. Forced disappearances and killings. You all are well aware that former security soldiers, they have been killed, forcefully disappeared, and I have reports from Kunar, from Nangarhar, from Kandahar, and there are reports that I've read, and I'm sure you all are well aware, from Ghazni, Helmand, Kunduz, that people, especially the former security forces, have been killed, forcefully disappeared, and especially in Nangarhar province, when people were killed, they would be hanged from trees. And even there were instances when in Herat, when some people were killed, they were displayed to instigate fear among the local people so that people do not raise their voice. Banu Nagar was one of the first police women who was killed in Ghor province, and I'm sure you all know about it. And it's not just this former security soldiers or personnel that are under attack, but civil society is also under attack. And since August 15, when the Taliban took over Kabul, the media landscape has totally changed in Afghanistan. At least 150 media outlets are shut at the moment, and there's very less female journalist presence, Afghan female journalist presence, and it's slowly diminishing with each day because of all the hard rules that the Taliban are imposing on Afghan women. Censorship is very high, just as I mentioned earlier, that no negative report should come out about the Taliban. They try to censor everything. And in recent months, at least 8 activists and 2 journalists have been killed, and many were injured, tortured, and at the moment, as I mentioned earlier, we have 4 female civil society activists who are imprisoned, and we should not forget about them. They only had peaceful gatherings. Peaceful gatherings are banned. People cannot raise their voice, and the good part is that Afghan women are so brave that despite the harsh conditions that the Taliban are imposing on them, they are still coming out, they are still resisting against the Taliban. Even entertainment is banned. People cannot listen to music. Can you imagine in 21st century, you are asked that you're not allowed to listen to music? The local TV channels and radio channels, they cannot broadcast music. Even a few months back or 2 months back, there was a new decree where it was said that Afghan women cannot be part of dramas. It's just for Kabul, but outside, when the Taliban took control of Kandahar, they banned that no female voice should be broadcasted from the local radios, even with the PCs about polio. If it had female voices, those voices were banned. So even entertainment is now banned in Afghanistan. As everyone else, so as Mr. Michael and Shakiba Murad said, that the economic situation is terrible. I have people who contact me and tell me, if you have friends, please ask them to donate. If they can donate €2, people in Afghanistan will be able to eat something. I have friends who had jobs 5 months ago, but now they don't know what to eat. If they have lunch, they don't know where will the money for dinner come from. The food prices are very high, and people are not able to buy the food. Just like WFP has said that 23 million Afghan people are facing severe hunger, and people have been selling their children, even young girls, into marriages, because that's for the families. They feel that if they marry off their girls as young as 10 years old, at least she will stay alive, or the money that they get, they can feed the rest of their children. People have been selling their kidneys. There were photographs that were circulating on the social media that people writing on white papers that I want to sell my kidney. Does anyone want to buy it? That's terrible. Nobody can imagine the situation that Afghanistan is at the moment. Any sort of voice against the Taliban is crushed, and we all must raise the voices of Afghan people. Afghanistan needs you, needs me as an Afghan to raise their voice, as they Afghan people are imprisoned at the moment. And the bottom line is that I will end on this, that we should be a voice against the media section or against countries that are trying to normalize the Taliban. Please, we need to raise our voice. They are a terrorist group. They are against Afghan people. They are fundamentalists. They will never change. They are not changed Taliban. They are the same Taliban, the killers of Afghan people.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yasmin Afghan, for that inner picture of what's going on in Afghanistan. It's a very sad scenario. And thank you for your activism and for all your services that you are providing to the Afghan people in Afghanistan, and I'm sure outside Afghanistan too. Thank you very much. Please stay around for, if you can, for a Q&A. We have got the last speaker, Mr. Matthew Ho. He has nearly 12 years experience with the US military and the wars overseas with the United States Marine Corps, Department of Defense, and State Department. He has been a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy since 2010. In 2009, Matthew resigned in protest from his post in Afghanistan with the State Department over the American escalation of the war. And Matthew has been on the speaking circuit, and he has been really talking a lot about Afghanistan, and he has been there, and it's his specialty, the entire region. And welcome, Matthew. You've got 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aftab, and thank you for having me here. And I'll just correct you. I don't think the region is my specialty. If I know anything, I know about the U.S. government, the U.S. military, the U.S. intelligence services, how they work. I think that's probably a more accurate explanation of what I can speak to. I'm really blown away by the three previous panelists, their discussion. I'm going to forgo a lot of what I had prepared for remarks, just because so much of it was already so well articulated. There's no reason for you all to hear, me say it with my Jersey accent, I mean, so, I will say, Shakiba, your testimony, your witness to what, our brothers and sisters are going through, the anger and the frustration that so many of us feel about this. We came out of the last 20 years where the United States government was spending roughly $300 million a day on the war in Afghanistan. At times the US Congress had appropriated $120 billion a year for the war. And I was in the Congress in 2012, 2013, talking with members of Congress and their staffs about this with a lot of other people. Since 2012, since 2013, human rights groups, refugee groups, veterans groups have been sounding the alarm about this, and nothing was done. And so the Afghans are the ones, of course, who bear the weight of that inaction. As an update on the situation for Afghan refugees, I live here in North Carolina. We have about 1,200 or so people being resettled here, and it's very difficult. The challenges are different than the one Shakiba described, but they are very real. One of them is just simply the cost of living. I think the State Department gives each family about $1,100 for rental assistance, and that rental, not just rental, it's cost of living, or it's living expense assistance. So it's not just rent, but utilities as well as food and some other things. $1,100 in the places where they are being resettled here in Raleigh and in Charlotte. The cost of a one-bedroom apartment is over $1,400. So, even once they get out of the camps that Shakiba so eloquently and beautifully and painfully described, the situations they're rolling into. And I had an experience with a young man who was a boxer. I think he was 21 years old, or is 21 years old. And I don't think he fully understood the circumstances he was coming into. He's a young man, and so he was excited to be here, and he has dreams, and his primary concern was finding a boxing coach and competing here. And my thoughts as I spoke with him about it are you're not gonna be able to afford rent. What are we gonna do to help you, let alone find you a boxing coach, So, and Michael, your analysis was absolutely spot on, really great. And particularly your comments about and the end of a foreign military presence. This is nuanced. This is complicated, something we've not heard that much in this country in terms of explaining the war. And in Yasmin, you're witnessing what you have been through personally, what people are going through. And I think that was the theme of what I was going to address, was the lack of nuance in discussion on this war that has occurred in the United States for the last 20 years, let alone the last 40 plus years, but the last 20 years has simply been an incredibly debilitating and limiting factor on policymaking. Yasmin, you said people don't want the Taliban, but they also don't want occupation. And I don't think many people here in the United States in policy circles get that. I don't think that has been clear in the American media at all until recently. And we have seen much better reporting in the last 6 months from organizations like the New York Times and the New Yorker, the work that say Asmat Khan and Matthew Akins have done for the New York Times, as well as what Anand Gopal has done for the New Yorker, has really shown a lot of that, shown that this war existed outside of Kabul. That, you know, I mean, of course, there's violence in Kabul, but, you know, and I know many families of friends in Helmand, and my experiences in the South in 2009 as we escalated the war and what I saw, you know, so when Asmat Khan from the New York Times does her investigation, and she's done such great work on this, she really is an authority on airstrikes, and she has been to these places, and she counts the bodies and counts the bombs, and then gets the information from the U.S. Department of Defense, and she does all that hard work to show what really has happened. She's done this in Syria, she's done this in Iraq, you know, and you see that the households in Helmand on average lost 5 people to American airstrikes, right? It's complex. It's complex because, you know, the same thing's occurring though with the Taliban violence. So this lack of nuance is really something that has really caused major issues for the American media, for American policymakers. However, I do think though that the American public for many years now have been against the war, because I think they have understood the complexity of it. They have understood that there is no good side in this war. Aftab and I were talking before everyone came on about the situation in Ukraine, and that, you know, when you get down to it, there's no good side. You know, there's no good side in that war with the Ukrainian government, which is one of the most corrupt governments in the world, versus these pro-Russian separatists who are murderous thugs in many ways. There's really no good side in any of this. And you have this, I think, this lack of understanding of the situation in Afghanistan that allowed American policymakers. And I think it's also the reason why, and I hate to see this, and I hope I'm wrong. You know, I really hope I'm wrong, and I'll be very glad if I am wrong, but I don't see a relief to the American sanctions. I don't see a relief to the unfreezing of assets, because I think it's politically poisonous for the Biden administration to do so, because we have this devolution of conversation and dialogue and explanation of the war that is simply nothing more than a Manichaean good versus evil. And meanwhile, 37 million Afghan people suffer, starve, freeze, and are dying. You know, again, I hope I'm wrong about that. As the great Yogi Berra said, you know, predictions are hard, especially when they're about the future. So hopefully I'm wrong about that. But, you know, I just want to use my remaining time because, again, everyone else covered the situation so well. I don't feel there's a need to go over it, and certainly we can get into it in the Q&As. But in terms of what can be done by your organization, what I've seen happen in other parts of the country, you know, I think an organization like yours has done a lot and can continue to do a lot. So forgive me if you already are doing this, if you're already aware of this. Maybe look at this more as a pep talk, but you know, in terms of who you can speak to and what you can do to get this nuance out, to get voices like Shakiba's, Yasmin's, Michael's voices out, and their analysis, their explanation of what has occurred, you know, with the media, both the local and national media. So your media organizations in Texas, as well as to the national organizations, CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I know that our local newspaper here, the Raleigh News and Observer, the letters to the editor are still one of the most read sections of the newspaper. It makes a difference. You may not see it, you may not feel it, but it makes a difference because you are educating those who are reading it, but you're also educating the newspaper staff, okay? You're also showing the newspaper staff, the media, where they are missing, what they are missing, as well as informing them that, look, we have local experts. We have people here who can speak to this issue, so that when we have Afghan refugees come here, when you do have something happening in Afghanistan, you have someone locally who can speak to this. I will also say with in terms of journalists, many of our local reporters, if you go to the website for whether it be the television or the newspaper, they have links with their email addresses. So if someone writes a story on Afghanistan in any context or any other aspect of something that, you know, touches this or other issues that you care about, email that reporter directly. Let them know that you appreciate them writing this story. Let them know what they got right. Let them know what they got wrong. And again, let them know that you are someone who's available to speak to this. You know, I hear that a lot from local journalists is often they just don't know who to turn to. And if you've got a local news source that relies, say, on the Associated Press for their international coverage or national coverage, like a lot of our local media does, you know, a lot of times you can contact the managing editor, right? And then the third thing with the press is go in and speak to them. So email the editorial board and say, hey, we are so-and-so. Can we come in and talk to you about the situation in Afghanistan or the situation in Ukraine or Syria or whatever, you know, is on your minds, what you want to address. And, you know, the editorial board may not turn around and write an editorial the next day, but certainly it's on their minds. The fact that you went in there and spoke to them made an impression. And again, they know you are in the community. I would say the politicians, you know, last time I was in Texas, which was 2017, you know, our mutual friend Leslie Harris brought me in to see Ted Cruz's office, right? And so I met with two very nice young men in Ted Cruz's office. I doubt they could find Afghanistan on a map, but they were receptive, okay? And, you know, it's not just at the federal level, but at the local level. It is really local agencies that are absorbing and dealing with this refugee resettlement. And so to talk with your city, your county, your state representatives about these issues, this isn't anything that's outside of their purview. This isn't a federal policy only issue. This is impacting our local communities. Okay, so with the politicians, again, another thing you may not feel you get anything out of, but you've made it known to them, and you've been there with them. With schools, you know, as a kid, I can remember, if I think back to when I was in elementary school or middle school, the things I can remember is not what, you know, my teacher said on a certain day, but anytime we had like a school assembly and there was someone from the outside who came in to speak with us. And it doesn't have to just be elementary schools or middle schools or high schools, but community colleges, as well as, you know, all the colleges and universities you guys have in your area. You know, approach them and say, we're a group who would like to come in and talk to your students about these issues. We have firsthand experience. We actually know what this war was like. We know what our brothers and sisters who had to flee is like. I mean, if you could have someone like Shakiba stand in front of young people and tell them, just as she told us, about the people who had to live with blood on their clothes for days, that will have an impact on those children for the rest of their lives. Absolutely. Because that story is going to have an impact on me for the rest of my life. And I'm a 48, soon to be 49-year-old man. You know, and then all the other things too, you know, again, I know you guys are probably doing a lot of this, but just as a cheerleading pep talk kind of thing, you know, get out to the community events, you know, encourage not just news media, but entertainment media to cover this. You know, one of the things that really had an effect on me as a young person that humanized war, and even though I ended up in the Marine Corps, and it's again, there's nuance, it's complexity, and I regret that. But as I examine my life and I look back, and one of the things I realized is watching the film The Killing Fields when I was a young person, when I was a kid, that had an enormous effect on me, because that humanized the war in Southeast Asia in a way that I was born in 1973, the same year American soldiers left Vietnam. And I mean, so Vietnam was a presence in my life because of films like Rambo. And then thankfully then there were films like Platoon. But to see a film like the killing fields, where it humanized the victimization of the people in a way that Shakiba and Yasmin explained today. I think if there's a way that you can approach that, whether it's supporting local filmmakers, international filmmakers, Afghan filmmakers, but I think that is another way that people can really make an impact. And I will finally say that a lot of people will say the anti-war movement is ineffectual. And I'll say that's completely undone by all the evidence we have. The Democrats win in the midterms in 2006 on the Iraq War. A couple other issues, but primary was the Iraq War. 2008, Barack Obama defeats Hillary Clinton. One of the major issues was the Iraq War. 2008, Barack Obama beats John McCain. Again, primary issue, the Iraq War. 2016, there's some really great research out of Harvard and the University of Minnesota about this. 2016, Donald Trump wins in key states, and in those key states, Wisconsin, Ohio, et cetera, in those key states, the counties he wins in are counties that had significant anti-war sentiment, primarily because those counties had disproportionate levels of casualties from these wars because they were homes to reserve and National Guard units that went over there and took casualties. But in exit polls, and what this study reveals, is that those voters who put those counties over the edge for Trump, that then put those states over the edge for Trump, many of them were voting on Trump's supposed anti-war stance. Now, that was complete nonsense. He wasn't anti-war, but he was saying it at the time. So, and what does that mean, though, in terms of the public opinion polls as well? We know that since 2009, 2010, public opinion has always been against the Afghan war in the United States, really since about 2006. It's interesting, from 2001, 2002, there's a lot of public opinion polling. 2003 to 2006, 2007, there's almost no public opinion polling in the United States on the Afghan war. And from later on, though, you start seeing, and it's mixed in terms of sentiment. And then after 2009, 2010, the escalation of the war, it doesn't work. And you see public opinion since then have been consistently against the war. What that means, though, in terms of, because even this past summer, where majority of Americans say Joe Biden handled the Afghan withdrawal terribly, you have a public opinion that's of 74% that still says he did the right thing by getting out. And you have this public opinion against the war. I mean, at one point in December of 2013, American public opinion against the war hits 82%, most unpopular war in American history. Not Iraq, not Vietnam, but Afghanistan, right? And what that does is, as you've seen, as everyone's seen, I'll wrap up with this, what the anti-war movement has done, because they have educated the population so well as too, I think, the public's own understanding of the war as they see it unfold. They see the immorality of it, the counterproductive nature of it, the lies of it. You have a change within the American government that shifts these wars from being overt wars with heavy U.S. military presence, okay, to wars that are conducted primarily through secret or covert means, where you have wars run by the CIA and the Special Operations Command, conducted through proxy forces, right? Utilizing contractors and drones, keeping the wars hidden because the wars are so unpopular. And this is how we can have these secret wars that stretch from the west coast of Africa, basically all the way to Pakistan. So that's, I definitely talk about that more later if you like, but that's just saying that you all have done a very good job in terms of educating people, in terms of letting people know about the wars. And then, as I said earlier, making sure that people understand the complexity of this, the nuance of it. That, as Jasmine said, look, people of Afghanistan don't want the Taliban. They didn't want to be occupied either, and so getting that type of messaging out, as well, then what the real situation is and how people are suffering the way Shakiba described it. as well as Michael, the way Michael described too, the silver linings in this war, just as there are some really awful, terrible, despicable things happening still and are continuing to happen. So I really appreciate being here with everyone, and thank you for putting this together and including me.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for wonderful analysis and telling us how we can move ahead to stop these brutal wars. And let me say that North Texas Peace Advocates has been writing letters to the editors. They have been meeting with the US congressmen and women and calling the senator's office to really expedite to do away with the sanctions and trying to really free the money, which is basically $9 billion of Afghan money for the Afghan government to really expedite it and let the Afghan government have it, basically through the NGOs or UN agencies, howsoever, because the need is great. So let me say that I do see Miss Beverly Hills, who is the president of Gendercide Awareness Project. Thank you, Beverly, for your support and being here. And I would really like to thank our board members, Tausif Kamal, Syed Hassan, Raja Muzaffar, Dr. Kaiser Abbas, who is the executive director, but he went down with flu yesterday, and so he's there, but we can't see his picture, but he has been really very helpful in organizing this effort here. So I do see that there are people who would like to ask some questions. We don't have too much time, but maybe 3 or 4 questions we can handle. So Tausif Kamal Sab, you had a question?
And I have a question after that.
Okay. You have to unmute yourself. Tausif Sab.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I have a brief question for Michael. You mentioned 3 crises, but I think you forgot to mention the biggest crisis, which is the crisis of the people of Afghanistan. The subjugation, the denial of basic human freedoms, like the women and children and men. They cannot even go out, they cannot associate, they cannot get jobs, they cannot go out in the public even, they cannot seek jobs, So this is the biggest crisis I think facing Afghanistan, apart from other crises. And I think that the time for the West to act upon this is now, not later. Now, when they have the power to freeze the funds of Afghanistan, Once they give up this power, they unfreeze the funds and resume the aid, they will lose any power, and the Taliban will have no incentive, to give freedom to the people of Afghanistan. This is the biggest, I think, the biggest crisis, human crisis, it's the biggest crisis. And associated with governance, of course, the bad governance or lack of governance is directly associated with this. Okay, and then the Taliban, I don't know how they will last. Because in Afghanistan history shows that nothing is permanent, no government is guaranteed to be permanent. The last 50 years, very more, the history shows. So, I don't know the future structure of the Afghan government, and who will be in power. Will Afghanistan share power with other ethnic groups? When actually Afghan Taliban, Pashtuns are in minority, actually, if you see the overall Afghanistan population. And will the external forces, the neighbors, Pakistan, how will they react, especially Pakistan, how will they react to Taliban losing power? Thank you.
Yes, should I respond to that question off top first? Okay, great. Yeah, thank you.
Please do.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll be very brief. You're absolutely right. Certainly one could argue that the rights crisis is a crisis in of itself in Afghanistan. It should have been included with the others that I mentioned. A few thoughts on that. To get to the very important issue that Matthew had made about the need to look at Afghanistan with a degree of nuance that one often doesn't hear in a lot of the commentary these days. But let's remember that even when the U.S. Military was in Afghanistan and well before the Taliban took over, and of course, going back a number of years, rights issues have been a major concern in Afghanistan. This didn't change only when the Taliban took over. And looking at the last 20 years during the period of non-Taliban rule, I think it's very clear that the status of women was certainly not stellar in much of the country, particularly in many of the rural areas. I think it's important to keep that context in mind. And I would also point out, I'm not trying to make an argument whether sanctions should be ended or not, but just to say that I think one could argue that given the changes that have taken place in Afghanistan since the sanctions were imposed, I think you could argue that rights are being violated because of the sanctions, particularly when it comes to women's rights. The fact that women cannot get health care, pregnant women cannot get health care. They can't get maternal health care right now because the healthcare facilities have all shut down because they're not getting any money because of the sanctions. I think one certainly could look at that through a rights angle as well. And I think one could argue that, yes, try to use sanctions as leverage to promote more human rights and women's rights in Afghanistan. But I think one could argue that women's rights have been imperiled even with sanctions in place. So I think that's an important point to point out. I also think that the notion that sanctions can be used as leverage to induce certain types of outcomes, behavioral outcomes from the Taliban that we would like to see, I think that's wildly unrealistic. I just don't think that's going to happen. There's been a lot of debate as to whether the Taliban has changed at all since it was last in power in the late 90s. And I think it has changed in the sense that it now understands the importance of public relations, it understands the importance of technology, it understands the importance of trying to get legitimacy overseas. But where it has not changed is in its fundamental ideologies and its fundamental views. No matter what you try to offer to the Taliban, it is not going to change its fundamental ideology, including how it looks at the issue of women's rights or human rights.
But
if it did that,
persuasion hasn't changed. It will not change Taliban.
Correct. Yeah, that's my point. That it would no longer be the Taliban if it were to change in that regard. So that's why I think we have to be careful about this idea of using sanctions as leverage in the hopes that if we offer enough assistance, that'll make the Taliban change. Very briefly, on the other point of Pakistan, one could have a whole other session on this, but I think that Pakistan has been experiencing something close to buyer's remorse in the sense that it has run its course, had been this long-standing relationship with the Taliban, and it sees now that the Taliban is in control, it's caused a lot of headaches for Pakistan as the Taliban tries to gain legitimacy and goodwill at home. It wants to go through these efforts to try to distance itself from Pakistan and show that it's no longer Pakistan's proxy, hence these disputes along the border and this very strong criticism of the Pakistani state from Taliban leaders. That certainly has caused some headaches for Pakistan. But I think at the end of the day, the Taliban will still look to Pakistan for certain types of support that it can't get from any other country. These days, that entails diplomatic support. It's Pakistan that's gone out there to the world and made a plea to the world to engage more closely with the Taliban, even to the point of putting money in the Taliban's hands. No other country is doing that. So I think that suggests the limits to this idea of tensions between the Pakistani state and the Taliban, even though there are some now, for sure. But I think Pakistan is concerned. Strategically, it benefited by getting the Taliban in power because it's always wanted a pro-Pakistan regime in Kabul. But there's going to be other challenges that it's going to have to deal with.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Syed Hassan, you had a question?
Yes. Well, one thing to answer Beverly's question, yes, the recording, we are recording this session, so we'll have that available to all the participants today. The question I have is releasing aid or the Afghan money to Afghanistan. The problem is we don't recognize the Taliban government, and no country in the world recognize. So whom that money would release to? I mean, I feel like, I was traveling with a friend and the panhandler came and asking for money. And my friend said, don't give him money, he'll do the drugs. I feel the same way, like give him food, not the money. Same thing, I don't, no intention of insulting Afghanistan. There's not that part of the analogy, but use that $9 billion to feed the Afghan refugees and people in Afghanistan in terms of food aid and other aids. But what is the, what good will come out from releasing that money to Taliban government?
Matthew?
This kind of plays into one other thing I've been thinking about talking about was how a lot of our assumptions, and when I say I say the US government's assumptions, the US media's assumptions about Afghanistan and the Taliban have been proven incorrect. Take it, Pakistan was just brought up, but 6 months ago, we were told that Afghanistan was going to fall right into Pakistan's orbit. The same with Iran. We were told that Iran was going to rush in and fill the void of the Americans. And the same with the Russians and the Chinese, right? And that hasn't proven true. Yes, there are interactions, particularly between the Pakistanis and the Iranians, as you would suspect for any nations dealing, with shared borders. And there is a relationship between Pakistan and the Taliban that has been ongoing and will remain ongoing, but is not as simple as many people here in the United States depicted it as, where the Taliban were simply an appendage of the Pakistanis. So it's more complex. And again, we get back to this issue of nuance. I think in terms of as Americans, I think we look at, again, $300 million a day into Afghanistan. What did it do? What did it build? We have to accept our share of responsibility for pouring hundreds of millions of dollars a day into a country and achieving nothing, and in fact, achieving worse than nothing, prolonging the war and creating these circumstances where the Taliban came to power, because what we did for decades was basically sustain a house of cards, right? As a friend of mine, an Afghan friend of mine said the other day, in sense of describing the situation the last couple of years was, basically you had a Taliban that believed that they could fight and win, and an Afghan government that understood that as long as they stayed in power, they were going to stay rich. So what, as well as too, the whole main American strategy in Afghanistan for the last 20 years was to force the Afghan people to choose between, right, a thuggish, kleptocratic government of warlords or the Taliban. Those are two really awful choices. But that's the American way of war, divide and conquer. So the same exact thing in Iraq. We could talk about all the different places that has occurred. Certainly they used it in Syria, they used it in Libya to a degree. Unfreezing the aid, I think we have an obligation to do so. I agree with Michael. I don't think you can find evidence where sanctions have worked. Certainly, a lot of examples where sanctions have made things worse. This notion that somehow that sanctions and keeping the money will force the Taliban to do what we want, I agree with Michael. They're not going to change, particularly when you push them into a corner. I think that's the same with, as we look at these crises with China or with Russia, you push people into a corner, they are going to push back. I will say this in terms of our assumptions about the Taliban that were popularly depicted and spoken about in the United States, is that these are rational actors. Look, they signed an agreement with, and they have control over their people. They signed an agreement with the United States in February 2020 not to attack foreign forces. And they held to that agreement for 18 months. Now, of course, they held to it because they were getting something out of it, but they held to it. And they had the ability to hold to it. They had the ability to keep their people to it, even when, in their view, the US was violating the agreement by attacking them. Now, that's a whole other issue about who was right, who was wrong. I don't think anyone was right or wrong. I mean, it's just the nature of it. You know, this is an organization that when Kabul collapsed, when Ashraf Ghani fled and Kabul was now an open city, basically, you know, according to the US military, according to General McKenzie, the head of Central Command, the Taliban turned to the US military and said, do you want to take control of Kabul until we form an interim government so we can take over? Does that sound like anything we heard about the Taliban for the last 20 years? Now, it doesn't negate all the awful things about them. It doesn't negate the horrors, you know, that people are living through right now underneath them, but it makes it more complex. So if those two things, we can have plenty of other examples about, you know, one of the reasons I resigned was because we would not negotiate with them. They were coming to us and they were trying to negotiate over and over again from the years 2001 up through about 2010, 2011. They were attempting to negotiate with us and we turned them down every time and then claimed they weren't willing to negotiate. One of the reasons why I resigned. So with that understanding, and again, understanding who they are, the horrors they're committing, the horrors that the Afghan people are living under, are we capable of working with them to alleviate the current crises, disaster, the suffering of the Afghan people? And I think that's something we need to pursue, because we can always turn the money back off again, right? But when we know what it's going to look like if we never turn the money back on. So looking at the last 40 plus years in Afghanistan, where has violence and aggression gotten, war, because sanctions are nothing more than a form of economic warfare, where has that gotten the Afghan people to this point? So my thing is, oh, let's try something different, at least at this point. You know, we can always turn the money back off, kind of thing.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. Michael, there is a question from Mr. Raja Muzaffar. Will Afghanistan have a spillover effect on Kashmir?
Hey, Aftab, I'm sorry, but I have to leave now. I want to really appreciate this. Thank you for including me. And everyone, please keep healthy and well.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
I appreciate your input. Take care.
Yeah, so interesting question about Kashmir. I know India is very concerned, and for good reason, that the Taliban takeover could have an emboldening, galvanizing impact on Kashmir-focused jihadists, like specifically those that have a presence in Afghanistan, Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. They don't have large presences in Afghanistan, but they are there. And I think what's very notable and what's particularly concerned India is that just within days after the Taliban took over in early September of last year, as I recall, a senior Taliban official gave an interview to the BBC in which he said that we have a right to defend the Muslims of Kashmir. We have a right to do that. We have a right to defend the right, the advocate on behalf of Muslims in Kashmir, Muslims in India and elsewhere. And it was relatively unusual. The Taliban generally has not wanted to put itself out there where it calls for taking positions on issues outside of Afghanistan. It has links to international groups like Al-Qaeda, but it had never tried to delve into these types of issues external to Afghanistan. So the fact that you had the senior Taliban official saying that after the takeover, that type of statement could really galvanize the JEM and LAT. And I think that really should worry the Indian government, which it has. But again, I think it's too early to jump to conclusions. I don't think it would be correct to suggest that the Taliban's behaviors and actions are going to be sort of established in a way that Kashmiri militants could be getting direct support from them or anything like that. I think the Taliban is focused on a lot going on right at home, for sure. So I think that, yes, there is reason to worry about galvanizing, emboldening impacts on these Kashmir-focused groups, but I think at this point I wouldn't go too far than that. It wouldn't go further than that. But I think broadly speaking, the impacts of the Taliban takeover for the India-Pakistan relationship are very real. Just because, as we know, we've had a major change in Afghanistan, where for the last 20 years you'd had a government that was very close to the Indian government, the Indian state, from 2001 to 2021. Pakistan had been able to exert influence mainly through the Taliban by providing support to the Taliban insurgency. But now it's sort of the tables have turned. You have a government that's very close to the Pakistanis. India has lost a lot of leverage and a lot of influence and access. How that will impact the way India looks at Afghanistan and how it impacts its relationship with Pakistan, that remains to be seen. But I think that's an important thing to consider.
Thank you very much. Hadi Jawad of North Texas Peace Advocates had a question.
Thank you, Aftab. I had a question for Matthew, but he's gone now. Just want to say thanks to Michael for his really spot-on analysis of the situation. Very well done, Michael. I just wanted to reiterate some things that Matthew shared with us. As a citizen of the United States, I realize that I'm a citizen of an empire. And that gives me certain privileges and advantages that other subjects of empires in the past did not have. As a citizen, we have been saying for a long time that we have capacity, the ability, the right to make policy. We have been engaged with the Afghan situation for 20 years. I remember protesting the day the U.S. started bombing Afghanistan. We were on the streets of Dallas protesting that war, and we have remained engaged with this horrible scenario. To me, the whole notion of using sanctions, the idea behind sanctions is to bring so much suffering onto a citizen population that they rise up against the government and remove the government from power. To me, that whole notion is unconscionable. We have seen the drastic suffering, the drastic side effects of these kind of policies in Cuba, in Iraq, when we were active in the 1990s. So I would urge, going along with what Matthew was saying, there are many, many tools we have as citizens of this empire to bring about change. Engaging with the media is really, really critical. Writing letters is very important. Engaging with policymakers, with members of Congress and senators is probably the most important thing that we do as activists. And I will urge everyone on this call to engage with us. We, as Aftab mentioned, the North Texas Peace Advocates regularly meets with members of Congress here in North Texas. We have Zoom meetings, we have access to their staffers. They welcome us, they welcome the dialogue discussions we have with them. And that in a democracy is vital. So thank you, you guys, for organizing this event and shining a light on the crisis in Afghanistan. It's heartbreaking, it's heart-rending. The U.S. must release the $9 billion that we're holding that belongs to the Afghan people. There are ways to get help, humanitarian aid, medicine, food, fuel, as the Afghans face this a severe winter without legitimizing the rule of the Taliban. To punish the Afghan people just because we don't like the government of Afghanistan is, again, unconscionable. We cannot hold the entire Afghan nation hostage because we have differences with its government. I'm not an apologist for the Taliban. I think they're just as bad as the mullahs in Iran, but we cannot hold the entire nation hostage. Thank you for allowing me to make that comment, and thanks again for organizing this very timely and appropriate webinar.
Thank you, Hadi. Thank you for your comments and observations. And I'm going to ask the last question with Ms. Yasmin Afghan. How can we help um, um, and to really improve the conditions or highlight the things that are happening in Afghanistan from here in United States? Ms. Afghan.
I think the most important thing is to have the real stories from Afghan people, not from what the Taliban government is trying to show to the world. And I'm sure there are ways to contact the common Afghan people and try to show the real picture what is happening inside Afghanistan. As I mentioned earlier, was that the Taliban are trying to show a rosy picture. They are changed Taliban and they are moderate now. They are not extremists. But as I said earlier, they are the same Taliban. They have not changed. And to continue raising the voices of Afghan people. My people are imprisoned, are held hostages, and it's only as I, as an Afghan who is outside Afghanistan, who can raise her voice for her people, and all the intellectuals. I request everybody that please do not forget Afghanistan and Afghan people. It's us that we can show to the world what really is happening inside Afghanistan.
Thank you very much, Ms. Afghan. You have a very difficult scenario in Afghanistan, and we all wish and pray that these issues are resolved in a peaceful manner. And thank you for coming here and talking to us. Thank you to all the speakers. And special thanks to Syed Hassan and Bob Sheiks for handling the technical side. And thank you to all the board members and all the participants here. It was a wonderful, wonderful discussion on the very sad situation in Afghanistan. And well, take care and stay safe. And thank you very much.
Can I add?
Okay, go ahead.
Just an announcement. I mean, first thing is great, and I think what a way to conclude this this whole thing. Ask the Afghan people what they want, how they want to handle this whole situation of chaos. But that is the most important thing that was said at the end by Yasmin. Ask Afghan people. I hope we can have another session sometime later where we ask Afghan people and have pundits listen to them rather than pundits talking and they listen. So, I mean, having said that, just a brief announcement. I mean, I have the recording of this this whole seminar, conference, and you all will see this in our website, as well as I'll try to email, because these recordings are so huge in volume. It's difficult to email, but we'll have somehow we'll communicate, or at least we'll have this on our website. It's sadw.org.
sadw.org. And here is another announcement. All the peace activists are really rallying together to avoid and to step the slippery slope towards a war against Russia and Ukraine and Europe. I think it's a 5 p.m. at Grassy Knoll in downtown Dallas. It's a group of peace organizations who have joined hands. So please, if you have time, it's beautiful out there.
This is today?
It is today.
Yes.
So 5 p.m. So please, Grassy Knoll, for peace efforts to stop the war in Europe. And that's it for us. And thank you very much, everybody.
Yeah,
Thank
I'm
you.
going to stop the
Stop.
recording, but since Sabra Bano is here
Thank
and
you.